Hey everyone, welcome again to A New Way to Museum. I'm Dr. Reese Barrick, the director here at the Sternberg Museum of Natural History. And as we get into our really exciting kind of a new topic today, don't forget to like and subscribe because we appreciate all of you and it really helps us out a lot. And we look forward to continuing to get to talk to you for a long time. So today, what we're going to talk about is a couple of really cool and probably most important things ever in the history of the planet. And it might not seem like much because we're talking about microscopic organisms, but they cause some changes that change the world and change the earth forever for the better. One, we got to go back billions of years. And when we go back billions of years, there's nothing but single-celled organisms, lots of different types of bacteria, and another group of a completely different kingdom, but kind of related to bacteria, called archaea. And archaea are anaerobic. They live in a world with no oxygen. And most life, when you go back 3 billion years, were archaea, and because the world had no oxygen. Then came along this little group of bacteria that are called cyanobacteria. Cyano, kind of meaning blue. We used to call them blue-green algae, but they're actually bacteria. And these cool little bacteria photosynthesized, whereas all of the archaea and some of the other bacteria around basically metabolized methane and hydrogen sulfide. There was no oxygen involved in their metabolic process. So they survived really well in a world with no oxygen. But the cyanobacteria photosynthesized, and we know as an end product of photosynthesis is the creation of oxygen. That's why we love all the plants on the planet, because they're all creating lots of oxygen. Well, these were the very first organisms to create oxygen on the planet. And interestingly enough, when the world's anaerobic and life has sort of evolved to live in an anaerobic environment, oxygen is toxic. It's a killer. So oxygen comes around and, it likes to react with all sorts of different elements. And so it's what our bodies use oxygen to combine with carbon, to metabolize carbon, and that creates CO2. We breathe out CO2, but the oxygen is actually attacking all of the carbon in our body, basically the food, and creates a lot of energy. And so that's really important for us. But if you don't know how to use the oxygen to metabolize things, then it's just going to attack all of your poor little cells and turn them into CO2, and then you die. So all these poor little anaerobic bacteria and archaea are just dying because there's this free-floating oxygen created by the cyanobacteria. Well, they could survive for a while because one of the other things oxygen does is it likes to oxidize iron. And in the early oceans, there's lots of free-floating iron. And the oxygen created by the cyanobacteria would grab that iron floating around, and it would sink to the bottom. And we have these cool things called banded iron formations, where we used to get all of our Chevys and metal for all of our super tall skyscrapers. But once all of the oxygen took all of the iron out of the oceans and sunk it, then it started making life harder for all of the anaerobic bacteria. And so they started dying. There was a huge mass extinction. Most of the different types of bacteria and archaea went extinct as the cyanobacteria kept photosynthesizing, creating more oxygen. And then at about 2.33 billion years ago, all right, so this is, Earth's 4.5 billion years old. At 2.33 billion years ago, there's enough oxygen that starts breaking out and dumping into the atmosphere. So before that, all the oxygen is just in the ocean, oxidizing things. Now it's broken out into the atmosphere. There's enough free oxygen. All right, so that's pretty cool because now we're starting to get oxygen in the atmosphere. And the thing is, even the cyanobacteria have to figure out how to not be killed by the oxygen that they're making. All right, so lots of things are dying, but we now have enough free oxygen, it's getting into the atmosphere. So now things really get interesting because things have been dying, and we have to figure out how to survive. Well, what's really cool is a lot of these different bacteria are figuring out a little more complex ways to keep their cells together. And all of these cells are what we call prokaryotes. Right? They don't have a nucleus, right? So that's all tightened up. And so we don't have eukaryotic cells. What does that mean? That's the plants and animals today. So what happens is some of these archaea, in order to sort of figure out how to survive, they've eaten or engulfed some little other microscopic bacteria called mitochondria. And these mitochondria metabolize oxygen and create energy for the cell. So now all of a sudden, these archaea have a way to deal with oxygen. So they're going to survive. And these things eventually evolve into all animal life on the planet, which is pretty cool. And a little bit later on, some of these archaea happen to figure out how to engulf and eat some chloroplasts, things that are coming from the cyanobacteria that they're using to photosynthesize. So now these cells have figured out how to photosynthesize and deal with oxygen inside of their cells. So now we have basically the basis of plants and animals, which were the result of these different little archaea cells basically munching on other cells that are surviving, and now they can deal with oxygen. And now that they can deal with oxygen, it's a whole new world. And so we can keep pumping more oxygen into the atmosphere, and it's not killing everything anymore. Okay, so then what's fascinating is we can have more and more oxygen. Well, what does oxygen do in the atmosphere? Well, the atmosphere had a lot of methane in it. Methane's a huge greenhouse gas, much more of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Well, what does oxygen do? It takes the hydrogen and the carbon from the methane, and it turns it into CO2 and water. So now all of the atmosphere is losing methane and becoming water that hits the planet, into the oceans, and CO2. So the atmosphere is changing to a CO2 atmosphere and losing methane, which means you don't have as much greenhouse ability in the atmosphere, so the planet gets colder. And it gets colder so quickly, at about 700 million years ago, it freezes over into like a snowball Earth, which makes it really tough on all the little organisms again that need to photosynthesize, because it could be kind of a slushy ocean with not as much sunlight getting in for them to use for photosynthesis, which then drives a little more evolution in animals of things to eat down there that doesn't need the sunlight as much, and we get out of the snowball Earth, and the planet warms up again, and it sets up the stage of all of these organisms getting to be multicellular life, which we get to the cool things when we get into just at the end of the Precambrian. We start to get the Ediacaran fauna, and evolution just starts going crazy. All of this couldn't have happened without the cyanobacteria. And we know these cyanobacteria were around and did this because they made the first fossils. So you can go back 2 billion years. You can go back 2.5 billion years. And what you find, that these bacteria were slimy, and they would take sand, would stick to them. And so you get these layers of bacteria, sand or mud, bacteria, sand or mud. And they would make biscuits that have beautiful little growth lines in them. And these little biscuits then, because it's sand surrounding and encasing all of the bacteria, as they grew and got bigger, they fossilized really well. So you can look over here and you see all these cool big biscuits that are called stromatolites. And stromatolites are around today. If you go to Sharks Bay in Australia, you can actually see where the water is too saline for lots of invertebrates to come eat all the bacteria like they normally would. You get the growth of these cool stromatolites. Well, they weren't just in specialized areas, but 2.5 billion years ago, they were everywhere on the shallow ocean floor. And so they were really the first fossil that's easy to find in abundance. And they had different forms, with round ones, and some were more finger-like, depending on the environment they were forming in. But these first fossils were really important because they started creating oxygen, which drove other organisms to figure out how to deal with oxygen, which got us to eukaryotic cells, which eventually got us to all life today. So it's really kind of cool, and we've got all of this evidence of these stromatolites and their huge importance, A, in causing a mass extinction of other bacteria, and B, setting the stage for all complex life today. And so we have to give a real appreciation and thank you to stromatolites for creating a world in which we can live in today. And you can see this if you again, we're sort of in the middle of Sahara sea monsters, and this is the beginning of this exhibit. So if you get a chance, you can come see Sahara sea monsters when it comes to a city near you. But just think about how life got here today, and from its earliest origins of these cool, slimy cyanobacteria. All right, thanks everybody for joining us. I'm Reese Barrick, and this is A New Way to Museum, and we'll see you again next week. Thanks for joining us in A New Way to Museum with the Sternberg Museum of Natural History. If you enjoyed this video, like it and subscribe to our channel. Hit the bell for notifications when we release a new video. Support us on Patreon for early access and exclusive content. You can also follow us on all our social media. Links are found in the description. Thanks for watching, and follow your curiosity to new discoveries.